How is the Bible organized? Well, in general, you may know that it's 66 books. It's made up of what we would say in our English Bible is 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 books in the New Testament. The Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Maybe you haven't heard the Old Testament referred to as the Old Covenant. Why is it called the Old Covenant? Well, because this is what drives the Old Covenant or the Old Testament is the covenant that the Lord made with Israel through Moses. So the Mosaic Covenant is driving the Old Covenant. And that Old Covenant failed to accomplish what the Lord intended. And so a new covenant is promised. I will make a new covenant, the Lord says, with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers when I took them by the hand and brought them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke. And so a new covenant. So in general, you've got the Old Covenant or the Old Testament and the New Testament. But there's different sections in that Old Testament and we divide it differently. And so you may hear about the law of Moses, or maybe you've heard about Torah or Pentateuch. That's the first 5 books of the Bible. It's the story. It's the beginning of the story written by Moses. And so Moses writes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then that leads you into the next section when we talk about it in English Bible or American Church. We'll talk about the historical books, maybe that you've heard it referred to as historical books. In Hebrew Bible, we refer to this as the former prophets. You have the former prophets, Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings. And so you have the books of history or the former prophets. Then you've got the latter prophets. That's Hebrew Bible talk or Hebrew Bible speak, or maybe the prophets. When you think of prophets, you think of the writing prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. We call those the greater prophets or the major prophets and the minor prophets. The minor prophets are the 12, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, the minor prophets. But so you've got the Torah, Pentateuch, the law of Moses. You've got the historical books or the former prophets. You've got the latter prophets, the major or minor prophets, and you've got the writings, the Psalms and Ecclesiastes and these books that supplement. So the story of the Old Testament begins in Genesis and it runs through Deuteronomy. It runs through the history. And then all of these other books, your Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, all of these supplement. They reflect upon what's happening in the story. And that whole Old Testament story, it talks about Israel and Israel's failure. And the new covenant comes along. And so because the law has failed, the new covenant comes. The Christ, the promised Messiah who will fix all the problems, comes onto the scene, and his life is told in 4 Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We call those the Gospels. And Luke actually tells his story in 2 parts. It's Luke and Acts, Volume 1 and Volume 2, both written to someone named Theophilus, the first account that I wrote to you, Theophilus, about all that Jesus began to do and teach until he was taken up. And then the book of Acts is the second account. And so you've got the Gospels and you've got Acts. And then you've got these epistles. First, Paul's epistles. And Paul's epistles are ranged from longest to shortest. And so it starts with Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Galatians and Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians. And you work through all of Paul's epistles. And then there's this section we call the general epistles, written by Peter and James and John and Jude. And these were letters written to a Jewish audience, Paul primarily writing to Gentiles, and these authors writing letters to a predominantly Jewish audience. And then the final book in the Bible is the book of Revelation. It begins in Genesis, it ends in Revelation, and in between, this continuous story is told with different literary genres all the way through until the book of Revelation.